Welcome to UCS, and we're delighted this evening to be hosting a lecture on patient safety. And the format for this evening is that Paul Levy will, I think, be talking till about 7 o'clock, and then we'll have a question and answer session, which is going to be chaired by Mr. Osman. And then we will, hopefully, you'll all stay for wine and canapes afterwards outside the auditorium. And I'd like to hand over to Mr. Osman to introduce Paul. Know this, you're probably all very familiar with Mr. Osman, who's consultant vascular surgeon and clinical chair of the business unit for general surgery and gastroenterology at the Ipswich Hospital.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for your attendance this evening. This is a wonderful opportunity that we have tonight at Ipswich. I would like to share with you a little bit of how I came to know Paul and how he started his journey in Boston and wound up here today. I was in the United States a few months ago, New York, tending to my mother, who had gynecological surgery, and we were taking turns, my brothers and sisters, after her. So it was my turn. I was in New York for a week, and really didn't have very much to do as she was getting better. I have a brother-in-law who is an industrial engineer who works in the automotive industry in Michigan. I know things have been difficult in the American automotive industry. Spent about a year out of a job. Decided to do an MBA. And him and I talk a lot about healthcare, surprisingly, about process management and how we can improve our processes. He told me, oh, I've done this MBA at the University of Michigan, and one of the modules we did was on healthcare. And he said, have you seen the CD? So the CD he gave me was a CD-ROM from the Harvard Business School, which was a case study of Paul's hospital, the Beth Israel Deaconess, which is a hospital I recognize because there's been a lot of pioneering vascular work from people like Lagerfo and his colleagues. So I ordered this CD and watched what Paul had done at the Beth Israel Deaconess. Started in 2002. President, I believe that's right. And it was one of the most inspirational things that I had seen since I became a consultant. It was actually quite a relief to see that hospitals at Harvard faced some of the very same challenges we've been facing in Ipswich. Us, everybody is obviously having these problems. And what was even more uplifting was to find actually how these can be solved, and they were solved. Particularly, I was impressed by Paul, and then I thought, this is a manager who understands doctors. For the first time, I've come across somebody who understands doctors. So I Googled him, and Paul Levy, former CEO of the Beth Israel Deaconess, former CEO of the Boston Water and Sewage, I understand, which was another public sector institution there where they had many problems and he transformed. And I came across his blog, running a hospital. So I sent him an email. I saw on the blog that he visited a lot of countries talking about improving health. And in particular, the thing that the Beth Israel, after he took over, became world famous for was patient safety and avoidance of patient harm. And it's fair to say that he's considered one of the leaders in the United States in advocating for improving hospitals. And to my great surprise, the next day I got a response. And he said, hi, Izam. And I thought, oh. And I said, well, maybe next time when you're in Europe, would you mind? I said, great, I'd love to come. Let me know when you'd like me to come. So I'd come back by then, and I had this CD-ROM, and I ran to the office of the then chief executive, Andrew, who's in the audience, and I said, Andrew, you got to have a look at this. And Andrew took it away, and he said, yeah, that's really great. I said, he's prepared. Absolutely. And as I say, the rest is history. He emailed me and said, when would you like me to come? And he's here today. So he's spending a week with us. He's giving a series of talks. He's running a series of workshops on negotiation techniques, improving how we get on with each other, applying process improvement within the hospital, and basically sharing with us his vast experience in improvement, healthcare, maybe he can see one or two things that we do here in Ipswich. Proud of as well. He met with the board today and distinction that, you know, there are a lot of similarities between what the Beth Israel had gone through and what we're going through and have gone through in the past. We may not be Harvard faculty, but we care just as much about our hospital and our health service. And I think so without any further ado, it's a great honor actually to welcome Paul Levy to Ipswich. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, you have an advantage not being Harvard. We like to joke about Harvard that a lot of knowledge leaves Harvard, but very little comes back in. And that when a professor at Harvard wants to read a good book, he feels he has to write it. There's a certain level of arrogance in that system that I don't think is deserved. But I'm an MIT person. I went to college down the road from Harvard, so I have that prejudice. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. What I'd like to do is share some stories from our experience at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and some things I've learned along the way in the hope that they're of value. If they're not, I hope they'll be entertaining. If they're of value, please take what is of value. And I've already learned some very interesting things about your hospital, so I'm hoping it's a two-way engagement over the next week. I'm not trained in medicine. I'm not trained in hospital administration. As Isam mentioned, I've done other things in my life before running a hospital. I used to be in charge of the Boston area water and sewer system. Perfect training for running a hospital, if you can figure that out. I used to be the regulator in Massachusetts, regulating electricity, natural gas, and telecoms companies in my day there. And I used to be a professor at MIT teaching environmental policy and infrastructure planning and development. So when I arrived at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, it was a totally new environment for me. I really wasn't sure what to do or how to do it. I found a hospital that was in deep trouble financially because of some previous poor business decisions. And we worked our way through those. And then we had to decide, once we worked our way through those, what we would be for our community. What would be our purpose? What would we stand for? What standards of performance would we expect of ourselves? And in Boston, it's a very competitive healthcare environment. Within 3 miles radius, there are 6 large academic medical centers, all competing against one another. So it's a very intense environment. And we decided we would focus on quality and safety improvement, a story I'll tell you in a minute. But let's step back a bit, and because not being new to medicine, I was struck as I got involved by a paradox. And here's the paradox. I hope you will agree with me that the people who decide to become doctors are among the most well-intentioned people in the world, who've decided to devote their lives to alleviating human suffering caused by disease. And likewise, nurses, among the most well-intentioned people in the world, and likewise, other people in the healthcare environment. I think you'd probably agree with me also that those people tend to be of above average intelligence in terms of academic intelligence, their performance in school, and the like. Doctors in particular, they are very good at science and mathematics going through school, elementary school, middle school, secondary school. They tend to go to the best colleges and universities. To get into medical school, they have to be excellent students. And then they go through training in medical school and then advanced training as residents and fellows and the like. And so by the time they're actually in hospitals performing their duties, we have a group of extremely well-intentioned people highly trained, committed. And the paradox is this. Why is it that that group of people, that group of well-intentioned, intelligent, thoughtful people, working together, represent one of the greatest public health hazards in every country in which they work? In the United States, going to a hospital is the 4th-ranked public health hazard. We kill 100,000 people a year in the United States who don't have to be killed in hospitals. And I use the word kill advisedly. This is not people who die from their diseases. This is people who die because of errors, omissions, and commissions in the hospital setting. And many, many more are hurt, not killed, but suffer harm. And so what is it about this environment, this complicated environment in which doctors work, that seems to offset their good intentions? By the way, I don't mean to suggest by that we don't also take very good care of many other people, but the chance of being harmed is just too high. Well, I've discovered the answer to this question. And the answer to this question was given in a movie years ago in the 1960s called It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Have you ever seen that movie? Whoops, just one. Well, this is the two. Okay. I hate to say it this way, but there's a generational divide here. There are some people who remember it, and there are some people who don't know what I'm talking about. It's a very funny movie. It's full of all the best comedians in the world, and one of whom is Ethel Merman, and another of whom is Milton Berle. And there's a scene, which I'm going to play for you, that explains the paradox. And here it is, if we can make this work.
It was a terrible thing, terrible thing.
Oh, Russell, I feel sick.
Oh, take it easy, honey. These things happen, you know.
Now, what kind of an attitude is that? These things happen. They only happen because the whole country is just full of people who, when these things happen, they just say, these things happen, and that's why they happen.
Let's try not to get upset.
Come on, Russell. You've got to have control of what happens to us. If we left it up to you, we'd never hear the last of this.
We've got to have control of what happens to us. Here's what I think happens very often in the medical environment. I think that because doctors are trained as scientists, I think they believe that there's a statistically irreducible amount of harm that has to occur in hospitals. They can't believe it can get down to zero or close to zero. Now, I actually also agree that there's a statistically irreducible amount of harm that has to occur in hospitals. But I don't believe we're anywhere near close to that number. And that's where we part company. Now, why is that? And why might they have this attitude? I think it's this. I think it goes back to doctors being well-intentioned and highly trained and so on. If you go to any doctor and say, you know, you're really not taking very good care of your patients, the chances that he or she is going to agree and say, oh, you're right, I take terrible care of my patients. I don't think you would ever admit that, right? No, and in fact, one-on-one, you're taking good care of your patients. But the system of care in which you work often does not. And it's the systemic problems of a complex work environment that cause errors and omissions to occur. And the question we have before us is, how do we train doctors and other healthcare professionals, nurses and so on, to get as good at process improvement in their institutions as they are at what they're good at already? Now, the problem we have there is that doctors, once again, if you'll excuse me, and I say this with great affection because I have many friends who are doctors and I believe in them and I know that they're well-intentioned. Doctors are trained to be artists. What do I mean by that? Well, they're trained to believe that it's their individual creativity, their intuition, their insights, their intelligence, and their personal experience that is what they need to bring to bear when they take care of patients. And indeed, when there's a complex issue facing a doctor, there's nothing like that intuition and creativity and experience. But 95% of medicine is not complex. It's routine. And if we have a doctor or a nurse applying creativity to a routine procedure, and each one feels that he or she has the way to do that, we introduce so much variation into the process of care that there's no way it can be based on evidence. It's just an impossibility. If everyone's doing the routine thing a different way, someone's doing it wrong, right? It's just obvious. So how do we get there? Well, the answers, as in all life, come from football. In particular, I coach girls football. This is my 11-year-old championship team from several years ago. These girls are now entering university this year, this coming fall. Why do I mention this? I'm not here I want to make clear, I'm not comparing the emotional age of 11-year-old girls to physicians. I want to make that absolutely clear, although there are times. But what I'm suggesting is that what it takes to learn a new activity, like a sporting activity, is actually similar to what it takes to learn a new way of practicing medicine. And why is that? Well, if we think about people and the learning process that people go through, I find it helpful to think about the 3 stages of learning that people go through. What's the first stage? The first stage is interest. You see something that you want to learn. It might be a skill in football. It might be a skill in medicine. It might be painting or drawing or whatever it is. You get interested in it. The second phase is the troubling phase. That's distress. Distress. And what's that about? Well, that's about that we are creatures of habit. Maybe there's some evolutionary reason that we're creatures of habit, but we are, and we resist changing our own behavior or even our framework for viewing things. We resist that. And so we go through this distressful period as we're resisting that. And the third phase, after distress, is once you've learned something, is the pleasure of it, of having learned it. You've all been through those phases, and you've seen your own children, and you've seen yourself going through those phases. Perhaps you remember classes from your university days where a professor was presenting a new concept, and you just couldn't get it, and he or she was trying all different ways to get it to you, and then finally a breakthrough occurs, and you say, oh, that's what he meant. So what's the job of a leader in that situation, whether a leader of a football team or of a hospital or of a division of a hospital or even a task force in a hospital trying to accomplish something new? What's the most important attribute of that person? It's actually empathy. Empathy. Why is that? Because you have to understand where your students are or where your colleagues are in that learning cycle. Are they at the interest phase, the distress phase, or the pleasure phase, in order to know whether to gently apply or remove pressure in the learning environment to help them through that? So we have to get good at being, we who are leaders, I count everybody in this room, we have to get good at being good coaches. Now, the best coach in the world ever, by universal acclaim, is this fellow John Wooden. John was the coach of the UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles basketball team. Everybody in the world knew he was the best basketball coach, but most people also now acknowledge that he was the best coach ever. And one day, one of his assistant coaches came to him and said, John, I've been working with the guys on this new set of plays, this basketball plays, and they just don't seem to get it. What's the matter with them? And John says, well, you haven't taught it if they haven't learned it. In other words, don't blame the students if you, the coach, are failing to teach. Think instead about what it is about your approach to coaching or to teaching that's keeping them from getting there. Because after all, those basketball players and those girl football players and everybody else in your hospital or your university is a well-intentioned person who wants to succeed. We're not dealing with a group of misanthropes who hate people, who want to make things worse for their team. We're dealing with the most well-intentioned people in the world. So let's assume that they want to do well. Let's assume that they want to do good for society, that they want to grow personally and professionally. If they're not learning what they need to in terms of process improvement and the like, then we as leaders are failing in some way. It's not their fault. At that point, you've turned on its head the usual concept of leadership. This is not a hierarchical thing from on top, ordering people to do stuff and hoping they're going to learn it. Instead, it's more of a view of servant leadership, where you actually work for them. It takes a certain amount of humility, but also confidence at the same time as humility. You could call it humble arrogance, if you're looking for a phrase. You have to have enough confidence in yourself that you have something to impart, but enough humility to understand where they are in the learning process. So I have some examples from coaching girls football that I want to give you. I've written a book recently about this called Goal Play. Available on Amazon UK, by the way. That's my one advert. One day I'm coaching the 11-year-olds, and who are the football players in the room? Anybody? Okay. What's the most important skill for a football player to have? The most important skill? Close. Before you can pass it, you have to control it, okay? So the first step in football, you know the game, right? It's a pretty simple game. Our objective is to get more balls into their goal than they get into our goal, right? And the only way you can do that is if you get control of the ball when it comes to you. Because if it bounces off your foot or your head and the other team gets it, then they'll take advantage of it. So I'm explaining this to the 11-year-old girls, and I say, now girls, the most important part of the game is the first touch. When the ball comes to you, you want to be able to control it. But the most important part of the first touch is actually thinking about what you're going to do with the ball as it's approaching you. Because you would understand neurologically, if you wait until the ball is at your feet before you decide what you're going to do with it, the circuitry doesn't go fast enough, right? You'll just, especially under pressure, things will go wrong. So I say to the girls, now I want you to think about what you're going to do with the ball as it's approaching you, as it's rolling towards you. Got it? Got it? Everybody got it? Oh yeah, coach, we've got it. I said, let's try it out. And I throw a few balls out, and a ball comes running towards Margaret, and without thinking, she boots it away into the woods near our field. Not even on the field, but into the trees and the bushes. And so I turned to her and I said, Margaret, you weren't thinking about what you were going to do with the ball before it got to you. She said, oh no, coach. I was thinking about it. I just hadn't reached a conclusion. So, now what was the problem here? Going back to John Wooden, Margaret, by the way, that's the look. I mean, how can you not love that look, right? Margaret is a very intelligent little girl, now a big girl, loves to play the game, wants to get better at it, and I had failed to teach this skill to her. Why? Because I tried to teach didactically. I gave her a lecture. Well, those of you who had 11-year-old children know that a lecture doesn't work, right? Especially when you're trying to learn something physical. You actually have to learn it kinesthetically by trying it over and over and over again. Or perhaps among adults, we learn by the Socratic method more instead of a lecture, right? So I wasn't properly engaging Margaret through that learning process. So now we get to the hospital world. If our job is to teach and to implement so that we actually save lives in hospitals, how do we do it? Well, in our case, I'd been working at Beth Israel Deaconess for a few years, and I recruited a new chief of medicine, which is the biggest department in the hospital, a fellow named Mark Zeidel, who came to us from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. And Mark is an above-average chief of medicine. Now, why do I know that? Well, it's because he was born in our very hospital. And we actually have a rule in our hospital that all of our babies are above average. That might be true in your place too. But I knew it to be true in our place because I did a scientific survey. I did. I interviewed grandparents. And not once, in 9 years running the hospital, asking grandparents, how's the new baby? Did any grandparent ever say to me, well, not very good? Every single time. It was exceptional, the most beautiful baby in the world, and so intelligent, within 24 hours they could tell. So Mark was one of those Beth Israel babies, and 40 or 50 years later, he comes in as chief of medicine, and he arrives, and he's passionate about safety and quality. He arrives, and he says, we have too many central line infections in our hospital. Now, for those of you who don't know, a central line is a catheter that you put in somebody's neck or chest to deliver high doses of medication when they're really sick. It's a very important device and approach to use in helping patients get better. But because of the size of the catheter and where it goes, right near people's heart, if it gets infected, it's really a bad thing. And the mortality rate associated with central line infections is, depending on which article you read, 15 or 20 or 25%. Mortality rate, they die from this. So this is clearly something that you want to avoid. So Mark arrives at our hospital, he says, we have too many central line infections here. Now this is measured in cases per 1,000 patient days. And his staff says, what do you mean, Dr. Zeidel, too many? The national average is 4.2. We're at 3.8. We're almost 10% better than the national average. And besides, these things happen. And he says, well, they're not going to happen here anymore. And we're going to drive this down to 0. Now, this created a cognitive dissonance problem for our medical staff, the doctors, the scientists. Because in their heart, remember, in their heart, they don't believe that 0 is possible. But Mark is saying to them, look, this is preventable harm. So 0 is possible, and we're going to try to achieve it. Actually, he didn't say we're going to try to achieve it. He said we're going to achieve it. Now, if I, as the chief executive of the hospital, had suggested any such thing, they wouldn't even have paid attention to me. I had no credibility in such matters, even if I had been a doctor. But in our system, the chief of medicine is the king of his department. He controls the salaries of the doctors in the Department of Medicine. He controls their assignments, who gets to go to conferences, and most importantly, space, how big an office each one has. And then for the residents, he controls their lives because they depend on him for a recommendation to become a senior physician later. So when Mark Zeidel said that the target is 0, they stood there and said, yes, sir, 0 is where we're going to go. Now, how are we going to get there? So he had to teach them how to get there, and here's what he did. He said, look, let's check the evidence. Let's see what approach to inserting central lines and maintaining central lines has been proven in studies to be the most efficacious. And he assigns 2 residents to go off and search the literature on that. They were very excited because their chief of medicine had given them this assignment. So they go off and they report back, Dr. Zeidel, it looks like this is the best way to do it. He says, great, let's train everybody to do that. So we hold training sessions, practicums, using simulation models, using patients, real kinesthetic work, not just a lecture, kinesthetic work. And then they start keeping track of the numbers. There's an old saying that says you can't manage what you don't measure. So they're measuring, they're keeping track of the numbers. And here's the thing, every time there's an infection, they treated it like a sentinel event, like an adverse event, and did a root cause analysis to find out what went wrong. Now this is a total change in process, because previously, if there had been a central line infection, it just would have been reported, Mrs. Smith had a central line infection. And people would have said, these things happen. In this case, whenever it occurred, they would say, these things aren't supposed to happen. Let's find out what went wrong. Was there a problem with the training? Was there a problem with the protocol or whatever? And then some of the doctors and nurses said, but Dr. Zeidel, we want to do it the right way, but there's a whole package of stuff we need to do this right. There's the stuff, there's the drapes, there's a face mask, there's the whole thing. Sometimes we're in a hurry, and if we have to go to the supply room and pick out 7 different items, it will take us 20 minutes. And what if something isn't there and the patient needs a central line? What do we do? So he calls our supply people, our procurement people, and he says, can you put together a kit of everything that we need to insert a central line? And they say, sure. And within a week, it's there. So now when a line is inserted in our hospital, you go into the supply room and you pull a bag off the shelf and everything's in it that you'll need. No more excuses. And I'm watching this happened, and I'm watching the numbers go down and down and down and down. And I'm thinking, this is really good. So at the time, I was writing a blog, which at the time was called Running a Hospital. It's now called Not Running a Hospital, because I don't run the hospital anymore. And I wrote some posts about this. Now, thousands of people a day read this blog. And I wrote this post saying, gee, I'm really proud of what we're doing. And look at these numbers. And I presented to the public, to the world at large, the actual infection rates in our hospital, month by month, in real time. March was over. By March 15th, the number was up there. Now, what I didn't understand at the time was that this was unusual. I also didn't ask permission to do it. Now, that's the one good thing about being the chief executive. You don't have to ask permission to do certain things. Sometimes you have to ask forgiveness later, but in this case, I went ahead and did this, not knowing that this was unusual. And I was just proud of what we had accomplished. There were two reactions in our hospital to this. First, just like the little girls on the football team, believe it or not, the doctors were proud of the fact that I was proud of them. Gee, they really are just normal people down deep. And when they get praise for doing a good job, they feel good, right? You do, right? It's okay. It's okay to admit that. Even the most sophisticated, highly trained doctors feel good when people say nice things about them. That was one reaction. The second reaction was emails started traversing the hospital saying, do you know Levy's got a blog? Do you know he's writing about our central line program? Do you know he's posting our numbers for the world to see? Maybe we should try even harder to do this well. And it was at this moment that I jokingly like to say that I invented transparency as a management tool. And what's the story there? Well, there's a fellow named Peter Senge at MIT. Peter has written a book called The Fifth Discipline. In The Fifth Discipline, he talks about a concept called creative tension in an organization. The concept is this. If you establish an audacious goal for your organization, high-quality goal, 0 or 100% compliance with the protocol, whatever you want to do, and if you post that goal for the world to see, and if you also post for the world to see where you are relative to that goal, the delta, the difference between the two, acts like a rubber band, an elastic that pulls the current state up to the desired state over time. There's some psychological reason for this that I don't understand, but it actually works. Now, so what's the purpose of this transparency? Is it to say to the public that BIDMC has a certain infection rate so they can choose to come to our hospital instead of another hospital? No, it's not about competition. It's not about comparison with other hospitals. It's not about comparison with benchmarks, so-called benchmarks. There's no virtue in comparing yourself to a benchmark that's substandard. Right? Remember, the benchmark, the national average was 4. We want 0. We're comparing ourselves to ourselves. We've set a standard that we believe in, that our clinicians have set the standard that we believe in. That's our standard of care. And the transparency holds ourselves accountable to the standard of care that we say we believe in. That's a pretty powerful thing. Medicine doesn't do that a lot. People in medicine don't do that a lot. Things are private, confidential, numbers aren't out there. And I think one of the things we have to do is get used to this idea that transparency can actually help us get better. If for no other reason than we are admitting to ourselves when we've done something wrong, so that we can then get better at it. So we did that, and we did that with central lines. We did it with the ventilator-associated pneumonia. This is compliance with the ventilator bundle. And then the issue came up at my board of trustees, which is like your trust board, said to me one day, why are you posting our numbers, our infection rates for the world to see? This is going to embarrass our hospital. Patients are going to want to go somewhere else. This is terrible. This is stupid. Why are you doing this? And I realized at that point I had to train the board in quality and safety, how to govern quality and safety. So we held some retreats, and I brought in some of the world experts to talk about this, who reinforced what I was saying. And at the end of the retreat, the board said, you know what? You're right. We should do this. We should set a goal for our hospital of eliminating preventable harm. So over the next 4 years, please eliminate preventable harm in the hospital over the next 4 years. And by the way, during that 4-year period, we'd like you to post on the corporate website for the world to see how we're doing every quarter in terms of how many cases of harm we have and what kinds of cases of harm. So if you go to the BIDMC website, you can actually find this every quarter, types of cases of harm. That was at the retreat. Now, a couple months later, the board was having its formal meeting to discuss this stuff. And by now, they were getting a little nervous about what they had decided on because they were worried about how it would be perceived. So at the meeting, 3 questions came up. First question, do we have to call it harm? Because harm sounds like we're taking a stick and intentionally hitting someone with it, and we don't mean to do this, and we don't really hurt people that way. Can't you call it something else? And I said, sure, you can call it what I call it in my speeches, maiming and killing. They said, let's stick with harm. Then someone said, well, on the website, instead of the numbers, the absolute numbers, why don't we use percents? Because, you know, it's 40 or 50 people, a quarter out of 100,000 people who've come through our hospital. It's 0.000 something percent. Isn't that a better representation of how we're harming people and fairer to us? And I said, sorry, that doesn't work. We actually want to remind ourselves that every case of harm is a person. It's somebody's mother, father, sister, brother, or child. We don't want to depersonalize it. And you could just watch them sighing, saying, okay. But then the last question came up, which was the real question that they cared about. What if we don't succeed after 4 years? What if we don't hit 0? Won't we be embarrassed in the community? Remember, our board was business leaders from throughout the Boston area. So they were worried about being embarrassed. At which point Dr. Zeidel stood up and he said, you know what? I think we can get there, but even if we don't quite get to 0, each year there will be several dozen people who walk out of our hospital instead of dying in it. And I think that's worth doing. And they all voted unanimously to do this. This was the first hospital in the world that had ever done such a thing. And it was a very, very brave thing. And then we went to work. Now, there's a problem with transparency that I'll tell you about, which is, I'll get to that in a second. So first, a story about Tova. We have to get into the issue of mistakes and how we treat mistakes. So this is Tova, who is shown here at age 14. At age 28, last year, she and I had lunch together, and she said, do you remember that play I made at the tournament we went to when I was 14? 28. I said, sure, I remember, because I remember every play. And I said, you were playing sweeper. You were the last defender, and the ball came into our goalie, and she swiped it out into the field. She punched it out into the field. The other team got it, took a shot right at the goal, and you, Tova, stood up there, chested the ball down, and cleared it away. It was a great defensive play. She says, I don't remember that one. Well, what do you remember? Well, I remember I was playing sweeper, and a ball came flying through the air, and I tried to head it out, and instead, I deflected it into our goal, scoring the winning goal for the other team, not only for that game, but for the tournament. And I said, I don't remember that play. And she said, I was devastated by this, devastated. And I was sitting there on the grass after the game, crying my heart out, and you came up to me as coach and said, don't worry, Tova, you're a great defender. I am? I said, yes, the best defenders go out after every single ball, they make a real effort, and every now and then it deflects off and goes into the goal. You are a great defender. Says, I brushed myself off, stood up tall, held my head up high, walked away smiling, saying, I'm a great defender. Remembered it 14 years later. And she said to me at lunch, that season was very important to me. I learned a lot of lessons which I am now trying to apply in my professional life, which for a coach, you can't ask for much more, right, or a teacher. So what are the lessons there? One lesson is you never know when someone has made a mistake, when a kind word from you to that person will make a really, really big difference, not only in the moment, but actually in their life. And how often, unfortunately, in the medical world, when someone makes a mistake, do they get blamed for the mistake? And do we then do 2 things? One, create a negative energy for that person and the team, but also we lose the opportunity to learn from the mistake and apply the lessons of the mistake in the environment. So in our place, we had a little mistake. And the little mistake was this. I was telling Pete and Catherine about this at lunch. Patient woke up from orthopedic surgery, looked down at her ankle and said, why is the bandage on my right leg instead of my left leg? Oops. It was at that moment that her surgeon realized he had operated on the wrong ankle. He was really surprised and very upset. He actually might have been as upset as she was in his own way. I don't mean to denigrate what she was going through, but he's a very good surgeon and a very nice man, and he realized he had made a serious error. And what had happened? He hadn't done a proper timeout before the procedure, so he had operated on the wrong leg, notwithstanding a rule of our hospital that there's supposed to be a timeout. So we analyzed the case, and we followed up on it, and one of my trustees on my board said, "What are you going to do to punish this guy?" And I said, "Well, nothing." "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, first of all, he's been punished more than anything I could ever do. And if you're worried about deterrence, he will never make this mistake again, I promise you." But then one of the senior doctors in the hospital said, "Look, if we're trying to establish an environment here in which we try to learn from our errors so that we can do better in the future, we start punishing people for errors that anybody could have made, the mistakes will go underground. We'll never hear about them. The near misses will go underground. We'll never hear about them, and we'll lose opportunities for improvement." The other thing that occurred, so we said that to our this particular trustee, and he said, "Well, in my field, if someone made a mistake, they would be punished." Guess what he was by profession? An investment banker. Have you heard of anything so funny in your life? Only in Iceland are investment bankers put in jail, right? In other parts of the world, they're given raises and bonuses when they make mistakes. But what happened in this case, which is so illustrative of the kinds of cases we see in hospitals? As we like to say, the Swiss cheese lined up to create the mistake, or as they say in Holland, the Emmentaler cheese lined up, the holes lined up. What happened here? Well, why did the surgeon forget to do the timeout? Well, it was a complicated surgery that he hadn't done in a while, and he was rehearsing it in his head. And he was focused on that. He was just playing it over and over in his head so he would do it right. The anesthesiologist had a near miss on her previous patient, had almost administered the wrong medication, which would have been very harmful to that patient. She caught it at the last moment. Nothing went wrong, but she had had a near miss. But because of the culture of medicine, she never told anybody about that near miss, because to admit it to a colleague would have raised disdain from her colleague, any of her colleagues. They would not have been sympathetic. They would have said, "How could you ever make a mistake like that?" while in their heads saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I," right? So she was stewing about this. She couldn't let it go, and she was focused on that. The circulating nurse in the OR, whose job it is to document, to tick the fact that the checklist has been followed, had left the room briefly, came back, and the surgery had already started. So he assumed that the timeout had taken place. Tick. After all, a checklist is there to be checked, right? Tick. And there was a resident, too, in the room who, of course, didn't know anything because he was a resident, so he just was there. But the really interesting thing is the correct limb was marked. And it was under a drape. The other leg was draped. So why didn't the doctor look for the mark? Well, this goes back to a problem that's called normalization of deviance. And the problem is this. For the previous few months in the pre-op area, the markers, the indelible markers that are used to mark parts of bodies, were in short supply. So people had gotten into the habit of using ballpoint pens. Now, when you write on human skin with a ballpoint pen and then apply betadine, the mark goes away. The surgeons had gotten used to the idea that they might not see the mark on the body part because of this pattern in the pre-op area. That's called normalization of deviance. So if we're going to punish someone, who would we punish in this situation? The supply person who didn't supply enough pens to the pre-op area? The circulating nurse? Who is it? The answer is it's everybody's fault and nobody's fault. It was a systemic problem. So we decided that this was such an interesting case that we would tell everybody in the hospital about it and learn from the experience. So I sent out this email to 8,000 people in the hospital, because hundreds of people are involved in operations and other procedures. Now, when you send out an email to 8,000 people in Boston, in a hospital environment. Within 10 minutes, 50,000 people have it at all the other hospitals. And within 12 minutes, the newspapers have it. And we knew that that was going to be the case. We got lucky in this case in that the local newspaper said, gee, it's really unusual for a hospital to admit an error like this as part of its improvement process. Good for them. When was the last time anyone got good press like that? But we got lucky. And we went ahead and we did improvements, got the team together, a multidisciplinary team, and they revised our protocol and basically solved the problem in a way that would not have been possible had we not been so transparent about this. Let me move on a little bit. These are just some numbers of how well we started to do in our ICUs. National recognition. Okay. The girl in the middle is named Brooke. We're playing a match in a tournament. This is 11-year-olds again, and we were a better team than the other team, and they were just packing the defense. The other team was packing the defense so that we couldn't get through. I hate to think of a recent match where this was also a strategy that was employed. I won't mention any recent matches like that. And so we'd do our normal play. We'd come down the sideline, cross the ball over, try to tap it into the goal. But there were just too many people in the way, and they couldn't get through. And the girls were getting really frustrated. So Brooke came out. I substituted her out, and I said, Brooke, you know, you're the best dribbler on this team. Next time you get in the game, I want you to just take the ball. Ordinarily, I like you to pass to other people because we're a team and we pass to one another, right? This time, I'd like you to be a little selfish. Just keep the ball and walk it into the goal. What do you mean walk it into the goal? I said, well, just dribble past all those players and just get close enough just to tap it into the goal. Big smile. Okay, coach. She goes in, gets the ball at the 35-yard line, and goes toot, 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 around 6 players, 8 players, I don't know how many, and scores the goal. High fives from her teammates who understood that although that was not the normal way we would play as a team, in this situation it was appropriate. So what's the lesson from that is there are superstars in our midst in all these institutions. And sometimes their behavior seems not quite team-like, but when you can employ it in a way that's consistent with the strategy and tactics of the team, it can be a very helpful thing, and let's use those skills that we have. But there's another lesson here, which is that there are other people in the organization who are not viewed as superstars, who are, and who haven't been discovered yet. These are not the top draft choices when the Premier League is trying to decide who to hire for Arsenal or Man U or whatever. These are people who are just kind of on the field and, you know, kind of everyday players, but they have something to offer too. This one is Gloria Martinez. Gloria is a porter in our hospital, a porter. She has 2 jobs. One is to push beds and chairs around. The other is to deliver specimens from the GI department, where they're removed from people's colons and the like, to the pathology lab to see if they're cancerous or whatever that might be. Gloria one day noticed that specimens were being misplaced and not getting to the lab, and she took it upon herself to mention this to her supervisor. Now let me tell you about Gloria. She's a recent immigrant to the United States, Spanish-speaking. Her English isn't so good. No college education, just high school education. I think if we were to visit Gloria's family around the dinner table, we would not see the following conversation. Gloria, the next time you see something wrong in your hospital, make sure you make note of it and complain to somebody about it, right? Immigrant families don't have that attitude. Their attitude is, you're lucky to have a job, be quiet, just get paid and do your job, right? The fact that Gloria felt comfortable enough in our hospital to raise this issue, notwithstanding what might have been her cultural norm, was indicative of how we had created an environment in the hospital that basically said everybody has the right and the obligation to contribute to making this place better and safer. And we had trained the managers that when someone like Gloria comes along and says, I think I see a problem, the managers, instead of saying, I'm busy right now, tell me later, or I have too much to do, sorry, are trained to say, thank you so much for raising this. This is a really important issue. We're going to get on it. We're going to work on it. Her manager did the latter. As a result, we totally revamped the way specimens were collected and tracked in our hospital. Now, we gave Gloria what was called our Caller Outer of the Month Award, The Call Her Out of the Month award is an award that our board invented to recognize people who had frontline staff who had noticed a problem and felt empowered to call it out. And Gloria got the first one. The award doesn't go to people who solve a problem. It goes to people who notice a problem and mention it. So Gloria gets in front of the board, which is a group of suits, right? This is pretty intimidating. She's 23 years old, high school educated, doesn't speak the language very well, sitting in front of these very impressive business people in their suits and their fancy dresses and all clearly wealthy people, well accomplished. And she says the following in what turned out to be quite eloquent English. She said, "Thank you for this award, which I accept on behalf of all of the other transporters in the hospital who believe that our job here is to try to deliver the kind of care that we would want for members of our own family." Not bad. I had board members crying when they heard her say that. That someone at one of the lowest jobs, so-called lowest jobs of the hospital, understood our purpose as an organization and was able to reflect it that way was very, very impressive. That purpose is not written in a strategic plan. It's not emblazoned in gold over the doors. It's just in the heart and soul of the people who work in the hospital. And we had gotten to that point over basically a 5 or 6 year period of really, really working on it to make it comfortable for everyone to feel they were part of that mission. So that's secret message, secret weapon number one. Secret weapon number two are the patients. This is what the entrance to our ICU used to look like. Not very welcoming to families, right? And Maureen Bisignano, who some of you may know from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, her mother or some other family member was in the ICU for a few weeks, and she came to me afterwards and said, "You know, you give great medical care there, but your approach to families is in the dark ages, and you need to engage them more." And we said, okay. So we established a patient family advisory council to advise us on how to deliver care in our ICUs. Ooh, think about that. We're asking lay people who don't know anything about medicine to advise us on how to do this. So at the first meeting, someone says, "Why do you have visiting hours in your ICUs?" And we said, "What do you mean?" "Of course we have visiting hours in the ICUs." "Well, why do you have them?" "Well, because we do. We've always had visiting hours." But she says, "Look, when my husband is in the ICU and he's unconscious or on a respirator, wouldn't it be handy for you to have an adult there who knows his medical history to talk to the nurses and to the doctors whenever the doctors happen to come through, to be helpful and to take information and to give information and so on?" And the staff sits there and says, "Oh, yeah. But we do these really ugly things in ICUs. You know, we do intubations and extubations and perturbations and who knows what else. And they're very disturbing to watch." And she says, "Just tell me when you're going to do that. If I don't want to watch, I'll go out and get a cup of coffee, and then I'll come back in." And a month later, there were no longer visiting hours in the ICU. The stop signs came down. You could just go in and see your family members. So we did a series of things like that and totally changed the manner in which we gave care. And then we got, as a result of this, we got an international award from the Society of Critical Care Medicine. 14,000 members in 80 countries named us as the winner of the 2010 Family-Centered Care Award, given annually to one hospital to recognize innovation that improves the care provided to critically ill and injured patients and families. That was good. The point is, patients and families have a lot to offer. Just a final couple points. People always say, well, how do you pay for these quality and safety improvements? You know, it costs money to do that. Well, the secret answer is it saves money. Because when you make improvements in quality and safety, in essence, you eliminate waste in your hospital. Wasted effort, wasted materials, wasted medicines, and the like. These are the actual numbers from our ICUs. The length of stay, the top line, dropped by 20%. From 5 days to 4 days in our ICUs. Why? People weren't getting pneumonia anymore. They weren't getting central line infections. We had been planning around this time to build a new ICU for our hospital, which would have cost well over $1 million in facilities costs. But then we would have had to staff it too, with nurses, respiratory therapists, doctors, housekeepers, the like. Multi-million-dollar investment over time. Because we reduced the congestion in our ICU, that investment went away. And as your financial people will tell you, avoiding expenses just as important as making more money. It works the same way. It's just the other side of the thing. As a result of that, we could actually see more patients. Look at the throughput of the patients there. That went up. Since we were getting paid per patient, we might lose some money by not having pneumonia, not treating pneumonia, but we were treating more patients. So overall, we started making more money. And by the way, look at the number at the bottom in terms of mortality too. That was a nice result. So over the course of 5 years, this is a chart that's put together by the Leapfrog group, a quality review group in the U.S. The left column, the left axis is resource utilization, which is to say the more efficient you are, the higher up on the chart. And the bottom, the x-axis is the quality score. To the right is better. And look at where we ended up. Now, 5 years earlier, we would have been at the intersection of the two axes. So the result was higher quality, better safety, fewer deaths, better patient care, and better financial results. By the end of all this, we had a competing hospital across the street from us called Brigham and Women's Hospital. Those of you who have read Atul Gawande's papers may be familiar with him, and that's where he practices. He writes wonderful things. They don't do the stuff we did. They were getting paid, in the US, you get paid by insurance companies for the most part for the care you deliver. Because of their market power in Boston, they were getting paid 15% more than we were for doing the same things. Notwithstanding that premium that they were getting paid over us, our financial results at the end of the year were equivalent to theirs in terms of the profitability of our hospital. So we had taken out of our system 10 or 15% in cost structure that previously had been there. So think about that as you're going forward during these difficult financial times. I haven't heard lately that Parliament is planning to send you much more money. I may have missed that announcement by the Prime Minister, but I don't think so. The same in the US. We have, whether it's federally funded healthcare or private insurance healthcare, we're looking at increases in revenues that, if we're lucky, will be equal to the consumer price index or your royal price index. But we know that medical costs are rising all the time because of demographics and technical equipment and new therapies and the like. So how do we survive and thrive as a hospital? Well, my answer is let's focus on the things that those really well-intentioned doctors and nurses really care about, which is the quality of patient care. But let's go through a learning process to help them learn how to do process improvement that includes input from patients and families, that looks at how the work is done in the hospital, and that makes it safer and higher quality. And the virtuous cycle that arises from that is better quality and better safety also lead to better financial results. So that's what we did at our place. We had a good time doing it. You know, this wasn't easy. It took a lot of training, a lot of time, but it actually worked. We were able to document it, and I offer it to you for whatever value it might have in your setting. With that, we'll take questions, I think. Yes? Thank you.